In this episode of The Cosmic Sponge, for all of you hunters out there, we have a Bigfoot bounty update from Middle America. A UFO is captured on camera hovering over Islamabad. The CIA seeks the help of a Stanford professor in order to unravel the mysteries of close encounter contacts involving government personnel, followed by several cases of apparent radiation exposure to UFOs. And then there's the donkey. Let's jump in. Steve, what do you got?
I want to know what happened to the donkey.
I do too. I looked. I really did. I tried to find out what happened to the donkey. Apparently nobody cared about the donkey. I care about the donkey.
Welcome to Positive. Maybe I should let you do it this week.
Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the podcast that talks about UFOs and other weird wonders in the world. I'm Jimmy Coe.
And this is Stephen Hawk.
And tonight, I'm going to hand it back over to Steve because he does this on a regular basis, and I don't know what to say next.
Tonight, we are going to be looking at UFO encounters or strange encounters that leave some type of physical trace, such as an illness or sickness. I find this to be fascinating. There's a lot of stories on it, but we rounded up some of our favorites. Jimmy, before we get into that, what you been into this week?
I was gobsmacked by a Republican state lawmaker in Oklahoma who wants to establish a Bigfoot hunting season.
Oh.
I'm not kidding. So that's why I was gobsmacked.
Gobsmacked. Before we got on the show, I was explaining to Jimmy that's not one of my favorite words. And so that is why he's using it so enthusiastically and often in tonight's episode.
Yeah, okay. I don't like it either, so I think I'm done with it. Anyway, Representative Justin Humphrey introduced House Bill 1648 on Wednesday, which, if passed, would require the Oklahoma Wildlife Conservation Commission to establish rules for a hunting season for the mythical creature purported to inhabit the forest of North America. Under the legislation, the commission would be required to set annual season dates and create necessary hunting licenses and fees. So, yes, all you folks in Oklahoma, that's your tax dollars going to some really good use. If passed, the law would take effect on November 1st.
I remember reading something about this. I think I did a news story on this way back when. I don't remember which episode it was on. But now, are they actually talking about a hunting license, as in, I'm going to shoot Bigfoot? Because I remember before, the law they were going to pass was you had to capture Bigfoot alive.
So this was published on January 21st, 2021. Oh yeah. So I thought it was 2022. No, it's 2021. So I guess they did this last year. So not so much news as just something that I found that I knew that Oklahoma was doing some wacky stuff with Bigfoot. Let's see. And I think they passed this, didn't they? It doesn't say in this article whether you actually get to shoot a Bigfoot or not.
Well, I'm pretty sure the law passed and they decided that you had to capture it alive and you couldn't harm Bigfoot. I'm not sure why you would even need a permit for that. I think I would go on the Bigfoot hunt first, and then if I found Bigfoot and captured it alive, then worry about paying the fine for being an unlicensed hunter. I'm sure I'm going to make a lot more money off having a live Bigfoot than what the fine in Oklahoma may be.
Yeah, probably. But
it's one of those tongue-in-cheek type laws they pass for tourism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Justin Humphrey, who's the one who put this bill up, said that it was mainly to establish a way to draw tourists to southeast Oklahoma and not necessarily to bag the fabled creature. He's not a Bigfoot believer, but he keeps an open mind. This is Representative Humphrey. Essentially, they just need to bring tourists into Oklahoma, and this is just really, I think, not a bad way to do it. You just pass a bill and you're pretty much done. And as long as you're not going out there shooting at humanoids in the woods that you can't clearly identify, I mean, that's probably not a good idea.
Well, you know what? If I'm not mistaken, there's some type of bounty on it, too. It was in the final bill that they would pay an exorbitant amount of money.
$25,000 to capture a live Bigfoot.
If I caught a Bigfoot in West Virginia, I would probably try to drive it down to Oklahoma to collect the bounty. What do you think?
Oh, definitely.
I wonder if there's any laws about transporting Bigfoot over state lines or federal?
I don't know, but I grew up with some kids who would probably pass for a Bigfoot. Matter of fact, our buddy Steve, who's a really big guy, if we just...
Every time we talk about Bigfoot, we talk about Steven.
Because he's like my own personal Bigfoot. I think if we just made it to where he couldn't wash himself or bathe for about, 6 months, yeah, he'd have the scent and he'd be all...
You'd be like that silverback Bigfoot now.
Oh, yeah. He's a little older now, so he's got a lot of silver. Of course, he had silver really young.
Yeah.
Silverback gorillas. Did
you see this video that was released on February 22nd, the story I have, over Islamabad, this UFO video?
Oh, yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is pretty interesting, folks. This is posted on our Facebook page if you want to take a look at it. There was an unusual object spotted prowling the skies of Islamabad, Pakistan, in broad daylight by an extraterrestrial enthusiast. They have some close-up photographs on it. It does kind of look triangular. It really looks like a big black glob in the sky. Maybe it's gobsmacked.
it's a gobsmack. Floating in the air.
Yeah, it was Arslan Warwick. Says he spent a lengthy 2 hours watching the triangular shape hovering above the capital city. The 33-year-old was mesmerized by the unusual object drifting over the city's wealthy DHA-1 district, and the clip has now sent sky watchers' tongues wagging.
Wagging tongues.
He recorded the UFO for over 12 minutes from different angles to acquire the best view. Anyway, it is pretty interesting, and folks, I recommend just jumping on our Facebook page. Just look for Cosmic Sponge on Facebook, and you can find this. I don't know. I mean, I watched the video, looked at the photographs, the zoom ins. I mean, it just looks like a black glob hanging above the city. What did you think about it?
This is really what I thought when I saw it. I think it would be really cool if people had a device available to them, like even in a neighborhood. People could go get that device, like a telescope, point it at something they don't know in the air, and get and automate the focusing.
And tracking or something.
Yeah, so that you could get a really clear picture, and you could see that these things have written on the side of them, made in China. And and you could really clearly see your balloon or whatever it is. Or if it's not a balloon, you'll really get a clear picture of something that's literally out of this world.
Yeah, I mean, it looks, and I'm sure he's taken it with the cell phone camera, which, again, they're not the best in the world for that purpose. I don't know, man. I mean, it doesn't look like a flying saucer or a spaceship or an aircraft. It looks like a big black glob, but it apparently hovered there for 2 hours.
I think it's a balloon. I
mean, you think about a drone, okay, you're thinking, okay, maybe a drone, but, most drones don't have that kind of battery life, even professional drones.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's probably a balloon.
Maybe, but it doesn't look much like a balloon to me. I mean, it may be a partially deflated balloon, I guess. It's possible. Mm-hmm. Very strange, pretty neat video, so jump on there and take a look at it. Now, we're only going to do 2 news stories tonight because, folks, what we have started is a brand new Patreon.
Yeah. So, folks, if you head on over to Patreon, our Patreon page, which you can get to from either of the show notes for our episodes, or head on over to CosmicSponge.com. We have a direct link there that's going to go over to our Patreon page. You'll be able to select from one of 3 tiers. Our lowest tier is $3 a month, and it is our Skywatchers level, and that'll get you access to our Discord servers and access to our bi-weekly comic strip, and also get you access to our additional news program, Weird Wonders. We also have a second and third tier, the second tier being Watchers and the third tier being Experiencers, and each one of those tiers have higher levels of Discord servers that will get you access to additional functions and features that we'll be adding momentarily, some of which will include the ability to be involved in polls so that you can select the kinds of episodes you guys want to hear about, select topics, and we'll do the research on them and come back and provide you with our take on those particular subject matters, and also give you the availability to have conversations with Steve and I and ask me anythings. So that's just a couple of things we have coming along very shortly with Patreon. Should be due out this weekend, and that will be February the 25th, 26th, something like that.
So if you could ask me anything, Jimmy, what would you ask me?
I would ask you, would you change Bigfoot's diaper?
I am not going to answer that.
You got to answer it. If the Patreons...
You're not paying for it, so I ain't answering it.
I'm not, but it's out there now, and you know that they're going to ask. They want to know.
Well, you know what? Somebody will just have to pay to find out, won't they?
That's right.
All jokes aside, we really appreciate anybody that would subscribe to that. We think it would be a lot of fun to take part in some of these things. And also, we just finished recording the first episode of Weird Wonders. It was a lot of fun. You know, it's an extra show, really. Kind of focused around the news and that sort of thing. As much as we love doing this and doing the research, which it really is pretty involved hobby, because not only are we getting together and producing the show, we have to do all this research every week to try and put the show together. So it's almost a daily task, something to be done for the podcast. And Jimmy does a lot of the behind the scenes work on the website and a lot of these things. If you can help us out, we would really appreciate it. Anything you can do. Let's move on to tonight's show. Well, I guess I should say, please rate and review wherever you listen to the podcast. It helps other people find the show. And don't forget, you can also support the show on our webpage with the Buy Me a Coffee icon if you'd like to just do a one-time donation. Look for us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, where we do all these news stories. Contact information is firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. On to tonight's show!
Show.
So what we're talking about tonight are strange encounters, particularly looking at UFOs and UAPs that have left some type of injury or illness with the people that had these experiences. Some of the sightings that I put the most stock in personally when I'm looking at these stories are the ones that leave trace evidence. Burned yards, wilted trees, wilted vegetation, grass that won't grow in that spot for the next 5 years. I mean, those are all strange things that we've seen around UFO landings, UFO encounters. But another very strange trace, in a sense, are some of these illnesses and injuries that people have received. So we decided to take a little bit closer look at that and pick a few cases tonight to go over. Jimmy?
Yeah?
I know you've done a little legwork on this one.
Yep.
So why don't you kick us off?
Are UFOs dangerous? Some people think so, and others know so. Dr. V. Raghavan, retired head of the Sanskrit department of India's prestigious University of Madras, believes bloodthirsty alien death squads have been with us since at least 4000 BC. Okay, so while he doesn't necessarily believe aliens with murderous intentions lurk behind every corner, he does believe there are living beings on other planets based on his 50-plus years of researching some of the earliest human writings. In the Mahabharata, many horrific weapons of extraordinary power are described, such as Indra's dart, which basically is a disintegration ray, or sound-seeking arrows for eliminating cells departments and mouth breathers, and most fearsome of all, the Iron Thunderbolt, also known as the Messenger of Death, a column that focused all energy in the universe for the purposes of genocide. We've come a long way since 4000 BC as far as our relationship with our alien visitors goes. For example, aside from a few cases of sunburn, short-term memory loss, and a temporary outage of clocks and motors, we get off pretty easy these days. Or do we? In 1973, Luis Fernandez was shot in the face by an alien carrying a ray gun disguised as a flashlight. Luis and his donkey were immediately paralyzed. 20 days later, Luis died, presumably due to complications from his encounter. While details remain sketchy, like why did he die in a psychiatric hospital? Why didn't the alien steal his wallet? And what happened to that donkey? Let me try that again. I tried to find out, but I couldn't.
What did happen to the donkey?
I don't know. Why didn't the alien steal his wallet? And what happened to the donkey? I'm just going to go on. It still brings up the very real question. If aliens can kill you with a flashlight, what chance do we really have? While silly, there are other accounts with more credible source material, and they provide us with cautionary tales of what happens when you approach a UFO without applying sunblock first. Let's jump in. Steve, what do you got?
I want to know what happened to the donkey.
I do too. I looked. I really did. I tried to find out what happened to the donkey. Apparently nobody cared about the donkey. I care about the donkey.
It would be interesting to find out If he died.
Yep.
I mean, the man died 20 days later. Is the donkey, was he okay? Or did he lose fur? Or was it a directed energy weapon that only affected him? I don't know. The man, I don't know.
I would love to know.
Inquiring minds want to know.
Inquiring minds want to know.
Now, one of these type of encounters with a UFO that left the physical traces on the body and injured the person was the Falcon Lake incident in Canada. Now, we covered that pretty extensively in episode 17, so we're not going to cover that today. But if you're interested in this topic and haven't listened to that episode or want to give it a re-listen, just go back to episode 17 and check it out. So the first case that I want to talk about is, now we're planning in the future to do military encounters, but I found this story pretty interesting. In May 1951, 1 year into the Korean War, Private First Class Francis P. Wall and his regiment found themselves stationed near Chorwon, about 60 miles north of Seoul, Korea. As they were preparing to bombard a nearby village with artillery, all of a sudden, the soldiers saw a strange sight up in the hills. It was like a jack-o'-lantern come wafting down across the mountain. As the GIs watched, the craft made its way down into the village where the artillery bursts were starting to explode. We further noticed that this object would get right into the center of an airburst of artillery and yet remained unharmed. Private Wall later told John P. Timmerman of the Center of UFO Studies in a 1987 interview. Suddenly the object turned, Wall said, and whereas at first it had glowed orange, now it was a pulsating blue-green brilliant light. He asked his company commander for permission to fire at the object with armor-piercing bullets from an M1 rifle. As the bullets hit the body of the craft, he recalled they made a metallic ding. The object started behaving still more erratically, shunting from side to side as its lights flashed on and off. Wall's recollections of what happened next are strange. "We were attacked, swept by some form of a ray that was emitted in pulses in waves that you could visually see only when it was aiming directly at you. That is to say, like a searchlight sweeps around and the segments of light, you would see it coming at you." He remembered a burning, tingling sensation sweeping over his body as if he were being penetrated. The men rushed into underground bunkers and peeped through the windows, watching as the craft hovered above them and then shot off at a 45-degree angle. 3 days after the incident, the entire company of men was evacuated by ambulance with special roads cut to haul out those too weak to walk. When they finally received medical treatment, they were found to have dysentery and an extremely high white blood cell count. To me, says Richard F. Haynes, a UFO researcher and former NASA scientist, they had symptoms that sounded like the effects of radiation. There were a lot of sightings. Apparently, dozens of men during the Korean War had seen similar unidentified flying objects over the course of the 37-month conflict. The craft often resembled flying saucers, according to unofficial reports, and as many as 42 were corroborated by additional witness reports, an average of more than one a month in just over 3 years. Now, there's a Korean War historian, Paul M. Edwards. Being a war historian, he's studied many records. Most of the researchers at the time believed that they were Soviet experiments based on German technology, post-war World War II technology, and some type of research into anti-gravity. These were supposedly so large they could carry 50-ton weights and were powered by electromagnetic propulsion, in a book that Paul Edwards wrote called Unusual Footnotes of the Korean War. What was being cited, it was suggested, were discs the Russians were testing over the Korean skies, but in the years since the fall of the Soviet Union, a number of Soviet reports of the sightings of UFOs over Korea have trickled in as well, and obviously we haven't seen this technology come to light since the 1950s. In the early years of the Cold War, it was often theorized that these craft might be Soviet or Chinese vessels, which technology unknown to American troops. Haynes believes this theory has been conclusively disproved. If they were, they would have been building those craft for use in later wars like Vietnam, for instance. The Soviet UFO sightings Edwards describes make it similarly unlikely, as do the impossibility of high-tech specifications of some of the sightings. In Wall's case, for instance, he described a kind of force field taking effect a while after he began shooting, where his bullets simply ricocheted away from the craft. In the years following the war, Wall lost contact with many of the men in his regiment. After the experience, he remembered his company agreeing that they would not file a report because they'd lock every one of us up and think we were crazy, he said. What made him choose to make a testimony, however, was the lasting after effects of his illness, including permanent weight loss from 180 pounds to 138 pounds, stomach problems, and periods of disorientation and memory loss after returning to the United States. He retired in 1969 at just the age of 42. His daughter Renee Denny says he spent 30 years out of work struggling with the after effects of the war. Back then they didn't know the name of it, but I guess you could say it was a form of PTSD, she says. Over the years he would tell and retell the tale of his strange UFO sighting. The story was always the same. It never changed through the years, but there was other fallout. He was especially affected by the sounds of airplanes and once knocked over his mother and sister to the ground after mistaking them for enemy troops. I guess he would have flashbacks. Wall's recollections of the UFO sighting were consistent and accurate, but whether what he remembered actually happened is harder to prove. So the symptoms were all the men that were affected by this beam had an increased level of white blood cells and dysentery. Mm-hmm. But the only problem with this story, I mean, it sounds very interesting. The only problem with this story, and I hate to pop a bubble because I know this is kind of a famous one, but he's the only soldier that ever came forward with this story.
And they had,
I mean, there's sightings. Yeah. There's reports of other sightings, but as far as being sick. Also, being a little bit of an amateur war buff myself, I know dysentery is really common among troops because dysentery is to me histolytica. It's like a disease where you drink unclean water, where your bodily waste gets mixed in with your drinking water or you're exposed to it. And so having a high white blood count would go along with, I would think, of having dysentery.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
I mean, your body's trying to fight an infection. But yeah, like for instance, the Army is crazy about making sure you put your latrine trenches way away from like where you camp, where you eat, where you sleep, or whatever. That's actually a very, very common affliction among combat troops is dysentery. I mean, it can take your whole company out. You know, I don't know. I mean, it also sounded like listening to what his daughter said, that suffered flashbacks and had other post-traumatic stress from the war, but who knows?
Or he could have really gotten zapped by some space alien ray.
Right. I mean, it did say he had to retire at 42.
Poor guy.
Disorientation, things like that.
Yeah, that's...
I just wish some of the other soldiers would have come forward.
Well, maybe they didn't have anything to say because they didn't see anything and they didn't experience anything.
Well... I mean, if it was a true story.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of UFO sightings in Korea, and apparently the Soviet records also describe the same type of craft. So we know that at least part of the story seems to be true.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, can't completely rule it out, I suppose, but it's not one I'd want to hang my hat on.
Right. Okay, man, what you got over there?
So I found this article, and it came out a little bit earlier than some of the recent podcasts and rounds that Gary Nolan has been making, talking about some of his research into the UFO phenomena, UAPs. So Gary Nolan is a Stanford University professor. And
everybody should know if they've listened to like the past 3 or 4 episodes. I think we've talked about Gary Nolan.
That's right. So
if this recently.
If this is your first episode, you should go back and watch the previous 43. So yeah, he was approached by a group out of the CIA, and they wanted him to analyze some MRIs and blood samples for some folks who had some encounters with some unknown objects, so that maybe he could find some correlations between them or something that he can maybe identify what potential causes of this basically brain damage. Now, the article is labeled, or the title of the article is, "The Brain Structure of UFO Witnesses Appears to be Different," according to a top Stanford researcher. So, while his primary research focus includes subjects such as biology of cancer and the immune system, he's been honored as one of Stanford's top 25 inventors. He holds 40 UF patents and has authored over 300 research articles, so he's no slouch. One of his side hobbies is these more interesting questions in science. So he has been known to analyze the bodies of what people claim to be aliens. So in some cases, people have dug up bodies that have strange cone-shaped heads or something along those lines, and they've sent them to him, so he'll analyze them and tell them whether they're terrestrial or not. Spoiler, they're all terrestrial.
So far.
So far. And
That's what they want you to believe, Jimmy.
right. But they have recovered some UAP materials, which we talked about last week, which are very unusual. And those are pretty interesting.
I read
Yep.
in a little follow-up. I should have done this at the first of the show. He also analyzed a sample recently that Jacques Vallée provided that was a molten sample that was dropped out of a UFO in the 70s, I think 1977 in Illinois.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't a crash or anything. It was like a hovering UFO, and it dropped this material. It was another one of the odd samples, the possibility of that byproduct that we had discussed of some type of process that we don't understand. It's pretty weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, I should have maybe mentioned that at the beginning of the show. But yeah, I'm still digging into that whole story.
Yeah, I will have to talk after the show because I'm really curious to find out a little bit more about that. And we'll tell everybody next week or something at the beginning of the show. And then the last thing, which is what we want to get to, is the brains of UFO witnesses. Now, all joking aside here, because we can make a lot of jokes about the brains of people who see UFOs.
Like what?
Like I wished I had one so I could see a UFO. Like that kind of thing. While he had expertise in blood analysis, which is why the CIA group approached him initially, there'd been too much time between the actual event and the time that they approached Gary that there really wasn't anything to be found in the blood work. But they also had MRIs prior to the event and after the event of some of these people, a subset of these people that they wanted him to analyze, which he did. And he found that there was some damage in a section of their brain called the basal ganglia. That's at least initially what they thought, that it was some kind of damage. But the type of damage they were seeing, and he said it this way, and this is a quote, some of their brains were horribly, horribly damaged. And so that's what kind of got me involved. To that end, Nolan examined the scans of around 100 patients. They were all defense or governmental personnel or people working in the aerospace industry, people doing government-level work, essentially. Although there was what Nolan refers to as a smorgasbord of patients, some of whom had heard weird noises or buzzing in their heads or got sick, he said there was a reasonable subset of them that had claimed to seen UAPs, and some claimed to be close enough to them that they got sick. Nolan's team tried to find some commonalities between them, and what they found is that there's a structure in the center of the brain, this is the basal ganglia, an assembly of subcortical components associated with various functions such as voluntary motor control, procedural learning, habit learning, conditional learning, cognition, and emotion. So it's a big deal. And it appeared to be injured, but what they were looking at couldn't actually be damaged, because if it were, these people would be dead. So they had to rethink their approach. And that's when they realized these people were not damaged, but had an overconnection of neurons between the head of the caudate and the putamen.
That which is even stranger, an overconnection after being exposed to UFOs.
Yeah, so, well, that's initially what they thought, that it occurred after being exposed to UFOs. That's not actually true. They had, some of these people had MRIs taken prior to it, to the closeness to the UAPs, and they still had it before they ever encountered them. Oh. And then they started looking at their relatives, close relatives, and found that they too had the same kind of structures in their brains. So there's a genetic component, and it's a very small percentage of the population, but it's out there. And he said if you looked at 100 average people, you wouldn't see this kind of density. But these individuals had it. And an open question is, did coming in contact with whatever it was cause it or not? And that question was easy enough to answer. And like I said, they had a handful of individuals that had MRIs taken from before their experiences and after, and they were already present before they had their experience with whatever structures or UAPs they saw.
Now, let me get this straight. These people actually have an over connection of neurons in a part of their brain, a specific part of their brain.
That's correct.
All of them had it before, or just some of them had it before?
They only had a small subset of them that had MRIs before and after. So of the ones that did have MRIs before and after, they all had it prior to.
But and what is the percentage of people that have been brought in to have him look at them? All of the people have this same thing? So it's like all of the people that have had these strange experiences have come in and tend to have this over connection in the brain? Is that what I'm understanding? But then it's not a cross-section of humanity.
No, all of these people had very similar experiences. So it's a subset that before you even start looking at it isn't a broad cut of society. It is people who all had the same or similar experiences. And of that, he looked at a particular subset of them whose experiences were, okay, I think it's better to say it this way. All 100 cases that were brought to him had symptoms that were similar. A subset of those said that they had come into contact with UAPs. And of that subset that had come into contact with UAPs, some of those cases had MRIs before and after showing that this increased density of neurons was present in that section of the brain,
right,
the basal ganglia, before, and that there was a genetic component because other members of their family also had it. And this particular section of the brain is partly what we call intuition. It controls that part of the brain where you're sensitive to the world around you by processing all of your inputs from your senses in such a way that you have heightened intuition about the world around you. Yeah, now, a majority of these patients had symptomology that's basically identical to what's being called Havana Syndrome. And they think that amongst the bucket list of cases, we had the first Havana Syndrome patients. And once this turned into a national security problem with the Havana Syndrome, he was locked out of all access to the files because now it posed a serious potential international incident for the government, and he was cut out of it. So that still left individuals who had seen UAPs. They didn't have the Havana Syndrome.
And so the Havana Syndrome, listeners, very briefly, because we have an episode planned to talk specifically about the Havana Syndrome soon. But what that is was some people who worked at the Cuban embassy in 2016 started experiencing very strange symptoms, so kind of an illness and some brain damage. So we'll get into a lot more about that. Yeah, it's definitely has the government and security, CIA and everything wrapped all around it. So it's a very strange thing that is 100% true that we'll dig into that a little bit further. But let's go back to the UFO people who've experienced UFOs. There's one of two things here. Well, there's one of three things. One is this is unrelated and just happens to be some kind of strange coincidence that people have had these issues and then they have this over connection of neurons. Or since a lot of people had it before, then maybe they have some kind of predisposition to have a sighting, but maybe it's a psychological thing.
Mm-hmm. So
it really, and unfortunately, I'm sure Dr. Nolan they probably didn't share enough information with him to specifically say there's 15 witnesses, all 15 of these people saw the same thing, and now they've got this thing going on, they're disoriented or whatever brought this thing to light.
So I saw an interview with him, and there are two podcasts out there that he's been on recently. One is Lex Friedman, and another one, I can't remember his name right now, but I'll post both of those on our Facebook account so you can go directly to them and get a little bit more information yourselves, listeners. But he essentially, in one of his interviews, indicated that this area of the brain that has that dense neural compacting is also something you see in schizophrenics. So it could be that they are seeing things that aren't there. So that's one possibility. The other thing he proposed is it's also likely, or not just as likely or as possible, I think that's a better way to put it, it's just as possible that people who have this dense neurological activity going on in that region of the brain are more sensitive to the world around them and can theoretically process information that other people can't process to that degree. So they're able to see things, they can perceive things that the rest of us can't.
Right.
So that's also a possibility in his mind. But he in no way, shape, or form is attached to any particular hypothesis about what's going on or theory about what's going on. He's open to a lot of things because there's just not enough information for him to feel comfortable of pointing to one particular thing as the more likely answer to this mystery.
That is very strange. Very strange. I want to follow up a little more on that. And like I said, listeners, we're going to do a whole episode on the Havana Syndrome pretty soon. So the next story that I have is commonly known as the Cash Landrum incident. And listeners, if you're listening to this show, you probably watch UFO programs like Unsolved Mysteries, and you've probably seen this. It's one of the most famous UFO cases in America. On the evening of December 29th, 1980, Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and Vicki's 7-year-old grandson, Cody Landrum, were driving home to Dayton, Texas, in Cash's Oldsmobile Cutlass after dining out. They said that about 9 p.m., while driving on an isolated 2-lane road in the dense woods, they saw a light above some trees that at first thought was an airplane approaching Houston Airport about 35 miles away. A few minutes later, on the winding roads, they saw what they believed to be the same light as before, but thought now it was much closer and brighter. They said that it came from a huge diamond-shaped object which hovered about treetop level, and that its base was expelling flame and emitting significant heat. Landrum told Cash to stop the car, fearing that they would be burned if they got any closer. Now, she was a Christian, and she interpreted the object as a sign of the second coming of Jesus Christ. She told Cody, "That's Jesus. He will not hurt us." Cash said she was anxious and considered turning the car around, but abandoned the idea because the road was too narrow and she presumed the car would get stuck on the dirt shoulder. Cash and Landrum said that they got out of the car to examine the object, but Colby was terrified. Now, that's the 7-year-old grandson. And so Landrum said she quickly returned to the car to comfort him. Cash remained outside, mesmerized by the bizarre light. The object was intensely bright and dull metallic silver and shaped like a huge upright diamond, with its top and bottom cut off so that they were flat rather than pointed. Small blue lights ringed the center, and periodically, over the next few minutes, flames shot out the bottom, flaring outward, creating the effect of a large cone. Every time the fire dissipated, the UFO floated a few feet downwards toward the road, but when the flames blasted out again, the object rose about the same distance. They said the heat was strong enough to make the car's metal body painful to the touch. Cash said that she had to use her coat to protect her hand from being burned by the door handle when she finally got back in the car. When she touched the dashboard, Landrum claimed her hand pressed into the softened vinyl, leaving an imprint that was evident weeks later. They said that the object had ascended over the treetops and rose higher in the sky, and then a group of helicopters approached it, surrounding it in tight formation. Cash and Landrum counted 23 helicopters and later identified some of them as the Boeing CH-47 Chinook used by military forces worldwide. With the road now clear, Cash said she drove on, claiming to see glimpses of the object and helicopters receding in the distance. From first sighting the object to its departure, they said the encounter lasted about 20 minutes. Now, here's what happened afterwards. So the witnesses claimed that after the UFO and helicopters left, Cash took the Landrums home, then retired for the evening. That night, they reportedly all experienced similar symptoms, though Cash to a greater degree. The claim was that they suffered from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, generalized weakness, a burning sensation in their eyes, and a feeling as though they were suffering from a sunburn. Over the next few days, Cash said her symptoms worsened, and with many large, painful blisters forming on her skin. When taken to a hospital emergency room on January 3, 1981, Clark writes, Cash could not walk and had lost large patches of skin and clumps of hair. She was released after 12 days, though her condition was not much better, and she later returned to the hospital after another 15 days. Cash claimed she was treated for cancer after being exposed to a radioactive UFO. The Landrums' health was somewhat better, though reportedly both suffered from lingering weakness, skin sores, and hair loss. Cash later developed breast cancer and Landrum severe cataracts. A radiologist who examined the witnesses' medical records for MUFON wrote, "We have strong evidence that these patients have suffered secondary damage to ionizing radiation. It is also possible that there was an infrared component as well." There was another witness to this event. Investigators later located a Dayton police officer, Detective Lamar Walker, and his wife, who claimed to have seen 12 Chinook-type helicopters near the same area in which the Cash Landrum event occurred and at roughly the same time. These other witnesses did not report seeing a large diamond-shaped object. Here's another odd thing about this case. Eventually, Cash and Landrum contacted their U.S. senators, Lloyd Benston and John Tower, who suggested to the witnesses to file a complaint with the Judge Advocate Claims Office at Bergstrom Air Force Base. In August 1981, Cash, Landrum, and Colby were interviewed at length by personnel at Bergstrom Air Force Base and were told that they should hire a lawyer and seek financial compensation for their injuries. Attorney Peter Gersten took the case pro bono, and the case wound its way through the U.S. courts for several years. Cash and Landrum sued the U.S. federal government for $20 million. Testimony of officials from NASA and the Air Force and the Army and Navy was given. On August 21st, 1986, a U.S. District Court judge dismissed the case, noting that the plaintiffs had not proved that the helicopters were associated with the U.S. federal government and that military officials had testified that the United States Armed Forces did not have a large diamond-shaped aircraft in their possession, as no governmental agency possessed an aircraft resembling the UFO. The case was dismissed.
Ooh.
Cash died at the age of 69 on December 29, 1998, 18 years after the encounter. Landrum died in 2007, just a few days before her 84th birthday. There's a lot more to this story. We could probably do a whole episode on it. But yeah, they got sick. In fact, the lady that stood out there the longest got really sick and ended up with these blisters, 12 days in the hospital, and was still sick when she got out and was released.
Yeah, so I had heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, they had said that the symptoms could be ionizing radiation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then, given the immediate symptoms, the dose that they would had to have received from ionizing radiation that would have caused them to die.
Right. Most likely they would have died. Like, for instance, anyone that suffers radiation poisoning or sickness, that their hair immediately starts falling out and blisters their skin, most likely would have died. But that's what some of the skeptics say. Me personally, I didn't have time to research this because we were trying to do several cases on this show. I probably would look at some of the data from the atomic bombings from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to confirm that. There's a lot of people who got pretty sick, burned, and blistered and stuff that lived on.
That's true.
They didn't die immediately after that.
And I think they thought that maybe an aerosol-type chemical was more likely than ionizing radiation. And I mean, in their house, I'm pretty sure they found an aerosol can that came from Alien Industries Incorporated. Right. They used heavy handling, and on the back of the bottle, I think it says something like may cause blisters, sunburns, hair loss, and pooping yourself. So maybe that could be the smoking gun.
I just find that to be a remarkable case. I don't know if it was radiation. It may have been something else. We don't even know what it is, but I just find it really hard to believe these two ladies with one of them's grandson in the back seat would have just perpetuated some crazy hoax, went to the hospital. How did she get all these burns? How did her hair start coming out? And I mean, there are photographs of that and, medical records.
Right.
That she was really sick.
Yeah, it wasn't like they were drinking brake fluid and, staying out in the sun all day.
I don't think they fit the profile of hoaxers that are trying to win money from the government. I mean, they sued the government on the advice Air Force representative at Bergstrom Air Force Base.
Yeah. What's
the story with the Chinook helicopters? Those were obviously U.S. military. Right? It's a very strange story.
Strange story. So have you heard about the Val Johnson case?
I don't know.
Val Johnson reported that while he was on patrol, he's a police officer, near Warren, Minnesota, about 2 a.m. on August 27, 1979, he saw a beam of light just above the road. And according to Johnson, the beam sped towards him. His squad car was engulfed in light, and he heard glass breaking. Johnson said he was unconscious for 39 minutes, and when he came to, he realized his wristwatch and the vehicle's clock had stopped for 14 minutes. The windshield was shattered, a headlight and red emergency light was damaged, and a thin radio aerial bent. Deputies responding to Johnson's call for help found the squad car sideways on the road, and Johnson suffered bruises and eye irritation that the physician compared to welder's burn. The story received national publicity, and you can still see that car. They have it in a museum where you can go check it out. Val himself doesn't really do interviews much anymore, if at all, and the notoriety was a bit much for him, so he tries to stay out of the public spotlight. But he stuck to his story all these years.
I posted this on Facebook. Somebody looked him up in 2015.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a little interview here, and I've got a few quotes from him. And that's a very intriguing case. And I've seen that car on some UFO shows where the aerial's bent straight over.
Yep.
And I mean, they're like, how could this happen? Alien forces had to bend this aerial over. I don't know about that, but I do find it to be a very, very strange story. No one can really explain and how he received those injuries. That welder's burn is really common. There's a lot of cases that I've heard about through the years where people have gone temporarily blind. If you look at UV radiation very long, like a welding arc, a UV bulb that may go into your air conditioning system, never ever look at one of those when they're on, because it can literally make you go blind. You can look at it and it doesn't hurt your eyes right now, just like watching somebody weld. That night when you start going to bed, you might wake up to go to the bathroom, you'll be blind, temporarily blinded. It will cause blisters, literal blisters on the outside of your eyes. And that's a common symptom.
Yep.
So how did this patrolman that ran into this light with this UFO end up with that injury?
I have a theory.
It seems so strange, but
I have a theory.
Okay.
My theory is that he was driving down the road in his police car, and at night he's taking classes for welding. And as he was driving, he was practicing his welding, and he didn't have his welding helmet on, so it caused temporary blindness, right? And then he got the welder's eye, and then he crashed, and part of the welding thing went through the window and broke his car up. Yeah. And then
flew out the glass and then bent the antenna on the way out.
Yeah.
Over, straight.
Yeah, in the wrong direction. That's correct.
Well, it bounced and then came back through, probably.
Oh, see, I like the way you think. And, you know, and he was distracted because he was eating a sandwich at the same time because he's a multitasker.
Well, he didn't do very good because he crashed.
Well, that's he put one too many things on his plate. He shouldn't have eaten the sandwich.
So I found this interview from 2015 of Val Johnson. He sounds like a really laid-back guy. I just love this interview. And it's so funny because if you watch some other UFO shows and stuff, they'll say, oh, he stopped giving interviews and he disappeared somewhere else or whatever. And actually, the person that wrote this article said he wasn't very hard to find and he was easy to interview.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know why they always make it out like it's a big mystery, like nobody can find him. But
trying to sell papers.
Yeah, I guess. He said after he wrecked it, I looked up in the sky and I said, well, shucks, what happened? Johnson recalled. And then I shuffled on with my life. For almost a year after the incident, his phone hardly stopped ringing. He's quoted at the time by an Associated Press writer, Barbara Dewey, as saying his wife was run ragged by the constant calls. He appeared on Good Morning America and in dozens of newspapers across the country. For a while, he was a very big deal. And then other stories came along and pushed me off the front page, he said. Thank goodness. He stayed on as deputy for a while after the incident. Then he took a job as chief of police in the nearby town of Oslo, Minnesota. In 1982, he was hired to set up Rousseau, Minnesota Police Department, but lost the job less than a year later over a funding dispute. Once you're chief of police and then you get fired, you're unhireable. He asked me how I'd like to take 60 angry phone calls a day, he recalled. I said, dang, I can do that. He said people don't call about it anymore. For years, people sometimes showed up on his front porch with theories about his experience in Marshall County. We'd sit in the backyard with lemonade and talk. They'd tell me what they thought happened to me, and I'd nod at appropriate times. Eventually, they'd go away.
I like this guy. I love this guy.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got some grandchildren, great-grandchildren.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he just puts it this way. I saw a ball of light. I drove toward it. Suddenly, it was in the car with me. It's unexplainable and will remain so. I'm happy with my mental stability.
Yeah. When did he lose his job?
Well, it says here that he was hired as the chief of police, and then he took another job to start a new police force somewhere and got fired over a funding dispute. Didn't have anything to do with the UFO stuff.
Well, I was just thinking if he could take 8 angry phone calls a day with no problem.
He said 60.
60. Oh, well, crap. If he could take 60
phone calls a day,
he could have worked for the help desk for Windows Vista.
Oh, my gosh. All right, man. Well, I think that's all the stories I have.
Yep, that's all I have.
Well, folks, I appreciate you all tuning in once again to Cosmic Sponge. We really appreciate everyone that is listening. We've noticed some more growth recently. We're really pleased about that. If you're helping that out by going and rating and review, we most definitely appreciate it. If you haven't done that yet, please do, because it helps other people find the show. And don't forget, tell a friend, tell a colleague, tell anybody. Just get on the street, wear a poster or a t-shirt that says listen to CosmicSponge.com, right? I mean, where else can you talk about UFOs and overactive brains in the same sentence, right? Am I right here?
My dinner table. But you people aren't coming to my dinner table.
Yeah. Well, it's because, you only eat fish.
And vegetables. And box wine.
Be sure and go to our webpage. It is CosmicSponge.com. There you can find all of our past episodes. Also, if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the webpage, there's a little coffee cup icon, and there you can support the show by clicking on it and giving us a one-time gift or donation. We really appreciate any help you could give us. We have just launched our new Patreon show called Worlds of Wonder. Is that what it is? What is it? Wonders in the World.
Weird Wonders.
Weird Wonders. There we go.
Man, you need to start attending the meetings.
I need to start writing things down is what I need to do.
It's lonely when I'm the only one at the meetings.
Contact information is firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. Please reach out to us with any comments or suggestions, and especially if you have an extraordinary story that you'd like to share with us and the listeners on this show. Look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Jimmy, did I leave anything out?
Nope, I think you covered everything.
All right, with all that being said, this is Stephen Hawk signing out, and I'll see you next week.
And Jimmy Coe, keep your eyes to the skies and your feet on the ground. We'll see you next week. Hey, you know what's the worst thing about attending those meetings all by myself? Anytime I need somebody to second me, second emotion, there ain't anybody there.
Yeah, right.
It's awful.
Anybody second that motion?
Anybody?
Okay, moving forward with that.
That's so stupid. Hey, you ever play that game when you were a kid with the flashlights where you spot people with flashlight? It was like flashlight tag.
I don't think so.
Yeah, when I was reading that story about the aliens paralyzing that man and his donkey, I was sitting there going, I wouldn't want to play with aliens, that flashlight game. Nope.
I still want to know what happened to the donkey.
I do too. I wonder what the donkey's name was.
Somebody probably said, what an ass.
Oh, that's just terrible. You should stop while you're ahead.
All right.
All right, call it a day.
That ass is dead.
That alien going back saying, I kicked his ass. After I paralyzed him. Poor dog. That's all for this week's episode of Cosmic Sponge. Please don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions or have a story you'd like to share, you can contact us using our email account, firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.